Good evening, I'm Natacha Kennedy. I'm an academic. I'm a sociologist. I work at Goldsmiths College, and I'm researching young trans people, trans children. And one of the sort of concepts I've come up with is called cultural cisgenderism. Now, I do know some people have a sort of problem with using the word cisgender. I did try and see if I could find another alternative. And I was looking up and looking up. I first fell on congenderate, which I got from concolorate, which means the same colour as. But it's not. It means this is the same colour as that, which doesn't quite work. Cis comes from the Latin. Originally, it came from cisalpine, which is the opposite of transalpine. Because part of Gaul, which we now know as France, was on the same side of the Alps as Rome. It's probably in the area around Turin, Genoa now. And so that was called Cisalpine Gaul, and the rest of Gaul was called Transalpine Gaul. Now, apparently, if you were a citizen of Cisalpine Gaul, it meant you could possibly become a citizen of Rome, whereas if you're Transalpine Gaul, you couldn't. But anyway, that's where it came from. I even tried putting the Greek in and calling it idiogender, but I didn't. I thought that sounded even worse. So I would kind of leave that one out. Anyway, it kind of turns out I didn't really want to start with this concept of cultural cisgenderism, which I actually really got from Dr. Gavi Ansari. He's now got his PhD. But it just kind of fell in that way. It was the study of trans people. When you start to look at trans people, whether it's through history or socially or culturally, it starts to turn into the study of the way cisgender people treat trans people. And as we've just had some examples through history, and I think if you go back further in history, you'll probably find trans people, certainly in Europe, were much more accepted than they were in the 19th and 20th century. I've just been studying a little bit about the Chevalier Liang, who was probably the first, as we would recognize her, trans woman. She transitioned socially in 1777. I think one of the things that helped her was that she was probably the best swords person in Europe. And could win any bout of fencing pretty much hands down, whatever she was wearing, whatever she looked like, and stuff like that. So I think when you're a practitioner of something that's very, very high status, as fencing was in those days, then you can get away with an awful lot. This idea comes from Susan Stryker, who's been doing a lot of history about trans people. And she reckons that around about 400 or 500 years ago in Europe, our culture changed and it became more material-based. So the spiritual, psychological, whatever you would call it, personal, was subjugated to the physical. And that meant it was very difficult for trans people. And actually, if you look at other cultures, native North American culture at the time, there's other cultures in South Asia, Southeast Asia, other parts of the world, they don't have that same sort of attitude to trans people. It's not quite such a sort of physically based material culture. So that's kind of where it comes from. And so I started to look at this idea that it was a culture or ideology. In sociology, culture ideology is pretty much the same thing. So the idea of cultural cisgenderism is something I started to look at. And I wanted to contrast it with transphobia. Transphobia is kind of a much more in-your-face hatred of trans people. I expect most trans people here have encountered TERFs and the sort of abuse and threats and that sort of thing that these people engage in. That is transphobia. The cisgenderism is actually more of a culture that erases and excludes trans people and comes from this material culture that has developed over the last 400 or 500 years in Europe. I found it very difficult to give a metaphor to try and find people to understand it, but I did find one. I remember watching ages ago a movie starring Cary Grant called I Was a Male War Bride, made in 1948. I don't know if anybody's seen that. It's quite a laugh, actually. I think it was 1945, the US Congress created a law called the War Brides Act. They were envisaging lots of American soldiers from Europe coming back and bringing European wives, women, girlfriends, whatever, back with them. Now, what they hadn't figured on was that actually some American soldiers were women, and in one instance, this American woman soldier met up, fell in love and got married to a Belgian army captain in Brussels. And the story is based on truth, but Cary Grant was this army captain, and coming back to America, when you've got a law that's based on American men marrying European women, and they're doing it the other way around, the bureaucratic nightmare actually made for a lot of comedy, and also the whole culture of expectations was that soldiers would be men and they'd be marrying European women and that sort of thing. It's the closest I could come to cisgenderism because it's a culture, and this bureaucracy, this act that the Congress passed, was based on this culture of kind of sexism, if you like, a type of sexism. So the fact that is the closest I can get as a metaphor that I can really find for cisgenderism suggests that actually it's outside the experience of a lot of people. So I tried to sort of come up with a definition which I've got published, and it goes like this. It's a tacit culture to start with. Tacit means it's communicated without language. Okay. It's essential. It's essentialist. In other words, it perceives that gender is something you are born with, and it's dependent entirely on the physical. It's fixed at birth. It's binary, and it's unchangeable. And finally, that it's imposed on you by other people. Okay, so the gendered subject is passive. Okay, so that's the kind of definition I came up for cultural cisgenderism. I think probably the most important part of it, though, is the fact that it's a tacit culture. It's something we learn, we understand, but we don't talk about. We know that being trans, at least children get to know that being trans is taboo, it's forbidden, but nobody actually tells you that it's forbidden. It's not, it's not read out in school rules, and children don't sit their kids down in front of the fire, you should not change your gender, that sort of thing. So it's this tacit culture that's important because people have this culture, but they don't realise they have it. It's a culture that's kind of invisible, but it's still there. A really good example of this was the case of Fernanda Milan, who was a trans woman refugee from Guatemala who arrived in Denmark to try and seek asylum there. And the Danish authorities put her in a male dormitory in the refugee camp just outside Copenhagen, where she was raped several times, and eventually, after a gang rape, couldn't take it anymore and ran away. And actually, the people who did that, the people who put her in there, weren't doing it out of transphobia. There was no accusation of transphobia there. It was cisgenderist. It was because the culture didn't accept more than two genders or changing between two genders. Okay, and there's actually another interesting example of a trans woman from New York who went to Atlanta, Georgia. She was arrested for having a blouse was a little bit too sheer. And when she was taken to the police station, arrested for indecent exposure, she was examined by a nurse and deemed to be male. So they put her in a male prison. So she had committed a crime which could only be committed by a woman, but yet she was imprisoned as a man. I'm not quite sure, but I have a feeling that the legal proceedings and writs and stuff like that are still going on in that case, because there's so many problems with that. But one of the big effects of cisgenderism, and I guess there's a link here with heteronormativity for LGBT people, but one of the big effects is that it affects young trans people, trans children. Trans kids know that it's taboo. They know they can't be a girl or a boy or non-binary. They understand this. They pick it up. As you know, all kids are actually fairly, or nearly all kids, have got very good social radar. You have to be when you're in usually a primary school, a small social grouping. You have to know what the right trainers are to wear and what the right language and how to put your fingers and stuff like that, to be socially accepted. And so, despite the fact that the average age that a trans person starts to feel they're different gender-wise, experience an epiphany is 8 years old, according to my study. Modal average was actually 5. Despite that, most of them conceal the fact that they're, and sometimes that concealment then functions as suppression, which is probably one of the reasons so many trans people do have psychological problems. We don't have problems because we're trans, we have problems because of the way our culture treats us. And there were some quite interesting quotes I got from my study, including one trans girl saying, I really wanted that pair of shoes, but I somehow knew I couldn't have them. I wanted to tell people I was a girl, but I don't know why, but I knew I couldn't. So there's this kind of sensitivity, the cultural sensitivity that most children have. But there's one group of children who don't have this sensitivity. Most of them anyway, and this is autistic and Asperger's children. They aren't able to pick up this tacit culture. They're not able to detect it because that's not the way Asperger's and autistic children learn. Okay, I've taught Asperger's and autistic children when I was a teacher, and you have to be very, very explicit about what you're saying. That's the way they learn. They need to have, generally, there's quite a wide variation, obviously. So they don't pick up this culture. And actually what that means is that young trans people who are autistic or Asperger's tend to become much more visible. They're not suppressing their transness, like non-Asperger's and autistic people are. And that actually, for them, I guess, is actually quite a benefit. But one of the problems with this has been that actually this cisgenderism, this cisgenderist culture operates on a whole lot of different levels. And so we've got psychologists and neurologists saying, look, there 13–20% of trans people are autistic, Asperger's. There must be some kind of neurological connection. There must be a comorbidity, as they call it. Well, actually, there isn't. It can all be explained by cultural factors, as I've done. But there's still this, if you're a neurologist, you work around, you have a white coat and a clipboard and a machine which goes beep and stuff like that. It's much more high status than if you're a sociologist, you have a tape recorder and talk to people. So actually, sort of getting people to understand this difference is quite difficult because of the relative status of the subjects. But I think it's actually quite important that people have been saying there's some sort of comorbidity, there's something wrong with our brains because we're trans, and it's a bit like people having something wrong with their brains because they're Asperger's. I don't not necessarily think they're Asperger's or autistic people have something wrong. They have a different way of viewing the world and interacting with the world. And so I think this is the problem, that actually now we're building up layers of cisgenderism. Eventually it becomes transphobic because of all that, the way they've interpreted it. So that's kind of where my research is at the moment. I just wanted to finish with a quote from a friend of mine, Sasragando Sassot, who I would suggest, if you haven't heard her speech to the United Nations, I suggest you Google it. It makes me cry every time. She's amazing. She's the first trans woman to speak at the United Nations. And the quote I got from her is, "I am not trapped by my body, I'm trapped by your beliefs." Thank you.